I have been on the struggle bus lately getting homemade food on the table. With all of the holiday and seasonal happenings, we have just been so busy. So, to make life a lot easier and to be able to survive the coming holidays, I am making 45 freezer meals, but out of 6 recipes. When I'm planning out a freezer meal batch prep like this, the first thing I do is figure out not only what I'm making, but how much of it do I need to make? Because I like to make these recipes in really big batches, and then I package them in sizes that are at least enough for one dinner and one lunch, if not more, for my family of 3. First up on the freezer meal menu is a double sheet pan of sausage, peppers, and onions. So I put in a big grocery order at Sam's and I ordered 2 big boxes of sweet Italian sausage and a pack of multicolored or tricolored peppers. And the thing is, when you're making a sheet pan meal, it's just as easy to make 2 or 3 sheet pans as it is to make one. Of course, there's a little more chopping, but in terms of actually cooking it, once you get everything on the sheet pan, they just cook together in the oven, so it's no extra work for you. Here I am chopping up the peppers and the onions. The peppers I cut just in regular slices. The onions I cut a little bit thicker, and I don't worry too much about separating the layers of the onion in a sheet pan meal because the onions tend to burn sometimes, so I let them stay a little bit thicker and stuck together so that way they don't overcook. For the sausages, you could definitely leave them whole and put them right on the sheet pan like that. But I like to cut them in meatball-like shapes or sizes so that way they cook a little bit faster. But then also later when we're thawing it and freezing it, it's just already ready to go and a little more versatile. This would be really good on like a hoagie roll or a sandwich roll, something like that, or even on top of a bed of rice. So when they're already cooked like that, it just makes it easier and more versatile upon thawing and freezing. But I'm just getting this on a parchment lined sheet pan and then drizzling it with a little bit of chili infused olive oil that I got from a local restaurant and seasoning it with just a little bit of salt and pepper. That sausage is already pretty heavily seasoned, so it doesn't need too much. And then I just put this in the oven at 425 and let it cook until it was done. I'd say it was about 30 minutes or so. The problem a lot of people run into, I think, when it comes to making big batches of freezer meals, especially during these really busy seasons like the holidays, is that it's hard to find a chunk of time to do all of that cooking. So what I'd like to do on these batch meal prep days is I like to cook some food and then other food I like to freeze prepared but uncooked. So that way I have some freezer meals that are ready to be eaten. All we have to do is thaw it, heat it up, and we have dinner. But then at the same time, while that's cooking, I am also preparing some meals that we can just really easily cook down the road. So while the sausage, peppers, and onions are in the oven, I am making a triple batch of meatloaf, but I'm going to freeze this uncooked because I do not want to wait for all 3 of these meatloaves to cook today. I have 6 pounds of ground beef in a large bowl, and one tip I have for these batch meal prep days is to keep your trash can right next to your counter. So that way, as soon as I empty 1 pound of ground beef into the bowl, I can just throw the packaging away without having to walk across the kitchen. But the other tip I have when you are making meatloaf is to mix the eggs and seasoning together in a separate bowl. If you're doing a single batch of meatloaf, it's really not that big of a deal, but one secret to a really good meatloaf is to not over mix it. So if you put the eggs and all those other ingredients right on top of the beef without mixing it first, it starts to get really hard to prevent over mixing the meatloaf. This is my hot honey meatloaf recipe that you can get over on my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. I will leave a link for that in the description box. In that recipe, I usually recommend cooking or sauteing the onions first, but on these meal prep days, I don't even worry about that. I do cut it a little bit smaller though, so that way it can cook better upon thawing and reheating. The other thing about that recipe is it uses steel cut oats to make a really hearty meatloaf. I found that that really helps hold it together and it's really delicious. I just divvied up that meatloaf mixture into 3 separate ceramic loaf pans, and then I am making the sauce in advance, but I am not putting the sauce on the meatloaf. I'm going to package it separately. So this sauce is a combination of ketchup, honey, sriracha, and cumin, and it's delicious. I never really measured the ingredients. I just kind of taste it as I go. But I'm mixing the sauce together, and now what I'm doing is I'm packaging up this meatloaf. First, I'm putting a layer of saran wrap on top to help prevent any air from touching the meatloaf, and then I'm covering that in foil. Normally, what I would have done is put each loaf pan then in a 2-gallon freezer bag, but I actually did not have any 2-gallon freezer bags. So I'll show you what I did just as a temporary holdover in just a second. But what I really like to do is package the sauce separately and put it right in with the rest of the freezer meals. So that way I don't forget it later. And that step is already done for me when it comes time to thaw and serve this meal, because nothing is more annoying than having a freezer meal without all of the parts that you need. For now, I'm just putting these in an aluminum pan and then covering it with foil until I can get those freezer bags. But I'm also labeling it, noting that there is plastic wrap on top of it. So that way I don't forget that I did that. Or if my husband pulls it out of the freezer to put in the oven, he doesn't cook it with the plastic wrap on there. To cook the meatloaves, I will take them out of the freezer and thaw them in the fridge for 24 hours. And when I'm ready to cook, I'll put the sauce on, pop it in the oven, and dinner is served. By the time I was finished the meatloaf, the sausage, pepper, and onions were ready. So I let them cool to room temperature. And now I am bagging them up in Ziploc bags. The deal with freezer bags is I do know they can be wasteful, but I reuse them a lot. So what I do for most of my freezer meals that I put in bags is I use one bag to hold the food, and then I reuse the outer bags over and over and over again, because those outer bags, they don't get messy at all. They're really just there to catch anything that might leak or spill. And I always make a note of what is cooked or uncooked on my freezer meals, so that way, no matter who grabs it out of the freezer, we just know what's going on. And sometimes you just kind of forget what you have done a couple months ago. So it's just nice to know exactly what's in there and what state it is in, so you are prepared to deal with it when it comes time to serve it. For cooked meals like this, I usually thaw it in a bowl of water, but you could also stick it in the fridge overnight and let it thaw that way. And then since it's already cooked and ready to go, I just reheat it, and then I serve this over a bed of rice or on hoagie rolls, and it is delicious. As I mentioned in the beginning of the video, the trick to making a lot of freezer meals is to make a lot of the same thing. So the meatloaf is at least 2 dinners and a lunch for us, probably a little bit more. The sausage, peppers, and onions is probably 3 to 4 meals for us. But another way to do that is to make a really big piece of meat in the slow cooker. So I am making a bone-in pork butt for shredded pork, and all I did was put it into my Dutch oven. I drizzled it with a little bit of aged vinegar. This is a cranberry walnut balsamic vinegar that I got from a local store, which I thought would be really nice for a holiday or seasonal touch to this pulled pork. And then I just put some water in the pot, I put it in the slow cooker, and I let it slow cook for about 13 hours. So we will get back to that later in the video. But while that's cooking, I am making some really easy dump and go freezer meal bags. One of the tricks I have found to be the most useful when it comes to making dump and go freezer meal bags is to just pick 1 or 2 cuts of meat and stick with that. It just makes it a little bit easier when you're shopping. It reduces sort of the mental energy that you have to use to plan your meals, but it also makes it easier to create an assembly line when you're putting those meals together. So I have 2 big trays of chicken that I got from Sam's, and with the first tray, I am making 3 freezer meal bags of cilantro lime chicken. And when I make recipes like this, I don't measure anything. So I chopped up 1 bunch of cilantro, I chopped up a handful of garlic, and then I'm just putting the ingredients in about a third at a time. So I put in some olive oil. I have 3 limes. Each bag is getting 1 lime. And then I divvy up the rest of the ingredients among the 3 bags as evenly as possible. I know some folks really prefer measurements, but for me, when I'm trying to get a lot of stuff done, I just eyeball it, and it makes the process a lot easier. And remember, you can always refine these after you cook them. If you feel like it needs a little more garlic, you can throw garlic powder in. If it feels like you need a little more sweetener, then you can throw some more in. And with that said, I'm also adding in about a tablespoon of honey to each bag, which I forgot when I was making the marinade. Of course, like anything else, it's different strokes for different folks. And if you'd like to be really precise, you should do that. But one of the reasons why I like to encourage letting go of that during batch meal prep is because it just makes it easier to get stuff done. It's been really hard for me to find time to make homemade food lately. So having some freezer meals that might be slightly off in some measurements is a lot better than feeling really stressed out trying to make food from scratch every night or ordering takeout or going out to dinner, because that is really expensive. To cook these, I usually put them frozen in my Instant Pot with about a half a cup of water and cook it for 20 minutes. You could also put it right into your slow cooker from frozen and cook it that way too. This makes really good taco meat. It's good on salads or even on a bed of rice, and I usually try to serve it with some sort of steamed vegetable. The next thing I'm making is another really easy dump and go freezer meal bag, and this is a sweet and sour chicken. So here we have that second tray of chicken breast, and I'm doing the exact same thing. It becomes almost meditative because you're just using the same meats, you're doing the same process, just with different ingredients. So I have that meat divvied up in 3 bags, and now I am splitting 1 can of pineapple amongst all 3 bags. So I'm using the juice and the actual pineapple chunks themselves. And I'm also splitting up 1 can of tomato paste among all 3 bags. I'm not usually too much of a canned food person, but for big meal prep days like this, I do use them sometimes because it is a little bit easier. I try not to get myself too pigeonholed into like, I never use canned foods and I never do this when I cook. I just do what needs to be done. And I encourage everyone out there to just do the things that need to be done that help you get through the day. And those things will change depending on the season. Like right now, I just am struggling with meals. So this is what I need to do to get things done. In those bags, I also added a handful of chopped onions and about a tablespoon of brown sugar. You could use honey too. I just really like pineapple and brown sugar together. And then you'll see in a second, I went back and added soy sauce and vinegar. I would recommend rice vinegar, but I was all out of it. So I used white balsamic because that's all I had on hand. But as I was writing sweet and sour chicken on the bags, I realized I forgot the sour part. So don't forget that soy sauce and the vinegar. To cook this, just like the other dump and go bag, I cook it from frozen in my Instant Pot with about a half a cup of water and for 20 minutes on high pressure. But you could also throw it right into your slow cooker and cook it like that. Once it's finished cooking, I like to make a cornstarch slurry and then thicken up that sauce because it's really good on top of white rice like that. Each of those dump and go freezer meal bags is 2, maybe 3 meals for us. So that is at least 12 meals just out of 3 freezer bags. Now it is November and it is cooling off here. So it is soup season and soups are really great for freezer meals. I am making a double batch of my sausage, kale, and white bean soup. You can get this recipe over my blog at moonandmagnolia.com. But in this case, I am not adding the kale until after I thaw it and serve it. And even then, I might not add it depending on if I have it on hand or not. For this, I'm using, again, sweet Italian sausage, but this time I am removing the casings. And just as I mentioned before about the freezer meal bags, I try to use the same type of meat for a couple of different meals. And that also helps if you find something on a deal like I got with this Italian sausage. So it just worked out better financially to make a couple meals with that sausage because I got it for a good price. So I'm removing the casings and browning it in my Dutch oven. And then I'm also chopping up some onions, celery, and carrots. And once the sausage is close to fully brown, I'm throwing the veggies right in there to saute. And then I'm also chopping up a couple of russet potatoes. Often when making a soup, I recommend chopping all the vegetables the same size. So that way with each spoonful, you get a bite of everything. But when I am trying to get a lot of meals done, I just kind of chop them and however they turn out, they turn out. Here I am deglazing the pot just to scrape up those brown bits and add some flavor to the soup. And then I'm putting the potatoes right in there and then adding enough broth to cover the potatoes. I've always found that potatoes cook better if you put them in the pot and then let everything come to a boil together. Oh, and I almost forgot the white bean part. I'm adding 2 cans of white beans to this soup. Then I bring everything to a boil and then simmer it until the potatoes are cooked. Usually what I do then is add in a big bunch of kale, but those greens, they don't really freeze that well. So I would recommend holding off on the kale and adding it when you go to reheat it and serve it. Or if you don't want the kale at all, you can totally leave it out because it's still delicious just like this. For the soup and the pulled pork, I let everything come all the way down to room temperature after cooking. That's really important when it comes to cooked freezer meals like this. If you put them in the freezer while they're still warm, they will create steam in the container. And then when you go to thaw it and reheat it, it changes the texture of the food. So I brought everything down to room temperature. The pulled pork, I separated out into bags and froze that way. And then the soup, some of it I am putting into these super cubes. So that way they are pre-portioned for really easy lunches for my husband to take to work. And then the rest I put into freezer bags and laid them flat to freeze. But all in all, because every single one of these freezer meals serves us for many meals, this is at least 45 meals for us to make it through the holidays. So that is what's cooking in our home lately. I hope you are off to a wonderful holiday season, and I will see you again next time.